In this podcast, I'm going to address our last required works, but I will combine this with a review of the millennium of art history that we've just dashed through. This unit covers more than 1,000 years. The catacombs date from around 200 CE, while our last work, the Roque and Pietà, dates from around 1300 CE. Whew! Two of the big College Board learning objectives, restated in plain English, are to understand how art changes over time and to recognize cross-cultural influences. In this lecture, I will talk about both of these themes as I look at depictions of Christ and Mary, picking up our last three works in the process. I'll start by talking about how depictions of the central figure in the Christian narrative, Jesus Christ, evolved over time that we are covering in this unit. But first, I want to clarify a really important point. The Christ of the New Testament and of our own Christian faith is a complex, multifaceted individual, teacher, miracle worker, prophet, savior, Son of Man, and Son of God. So, when I talk about changing depictions of Christ, I'm talking about changes in the emphasis that different cultures and different times have placed on different aspects of Christ's character and ministry. So, two common early images from early Christian art are Christ as the Good Shepherd, which you see here, sort of, in the Catacomb of Priscilla. I've included two other rather clearer Catacomb Good Shepherd images. You'll see the similarities. Early Christian art also frequently depicted Christ as a philosopher and teacher. Note that both Christ the Good Shepherd and Christ the Philosopher are images of Jesus as a young man. The more powerful but also more disturbing image of Christ crucified, which will become so prominent in later Christian art, is almost unknown in this early Christian period. But this image from the church doors of Santa Sabina is an exception. By the way, this is a required work, but not a required image. This apse mosaic from San Vitale illustrates the transition from early Christian to Byzantine depictions of Christ. Yes, Christ is still youthful and beardless, but still this is the Christ as ruler of the world, symbolized by the orb he is sitting on. The changes in imagery reflect some very important religious and political changes in the Byzantine era. Christianity is now the official religion of an empire that unites the power of the church and the power of the state. This is Justinian's church, although he never actually set foot in it, and it is clearly associating the authority of Christ with the authority of his empire. Christ Pantocrator, or Christ Lord of Hosts, ruler of the world, was probably the most common image of Christ in later Byzantine art. And no depiction of Christ is more iconic of Romanesque art than Christ as the final judge of all human beings, the Last Judgment. His throne signals his power, but this is the spiritual power over salvation and damnation, not the imperial temporal power of the Byzantines. This is a transitional work between Romanesque and Gothic. In our last class, I discussed some changes from the Romanesque tympanum at St. Foy. We see more focus on Christ's majesty, less focus on the perils of hell. So, let's move away from sculpture and consider the famous Gothic stained glass of Chartres Cathedral. Here is a nativity scene. Here is Christ's presentation at the temple as a young boy. And here is Christ's entry into Jerusalem. None of these is a required image, although Chartres Cathedral is, of course, a required work. Of the 29 images in the bay windows depicting the life of Christ, 20, really a large number, depict his birth, infancy, or childhood. And I think this tells us something really important about the Gothic era. This is the great age of Christian humanism, and Chartres' Christ, at least the one who appears in stained glass, was once a helpless baby and a young child. This is also an age when the adoration of Mary assumes central importance in the Christian faith, and I'll talk more about that later. But first, finally, I'm going to get to one of today's required works. In the Chartres panel, we see images of Christ that reveal more of his humanity, but nothing like the emotional horror of the dramatic work on the left, which has the latest date of all the required images for this unit. Depictions of the crucifixion were entering into the Christian art during the Gothic period, but the crucified Christ was generally portrayed as a triumphant figure who was overcoming death, not as a man who was suffering a painful execution. You can see this more triumphalist portrait in the Italian High Gothic crucifixion that I've posted here on the right. But the Rotkin Pietà presents the crucifixion in all of its pain and terror. It also presents Christ's mother not as the serene Queen of Heaven or the throne of wisdom or even the tender, loving Madonna, but instead as a woman in agony over the death of her son. So what's going on here? How has the context of Christian art changed? Both the Romanesque and Gothic eras were rather upbeat periods in history. Romanesque churches celebrated, among other things, the realization that the world was not going to come to an end in the year 1000. The food supply and population were growing, towns were re-emerging, and a self-confident Christendom even set off on crusades, which admittedly was not one of the church's finest hours. Gothic Europe saw the rise of cities, the establishment of great universities, and a Christian humanism that celebrated learning and human accomplishment, although always within a Christian perspective. Faith became more triumphant, but also in many ways more comforting, reflected in part by the new role that a loving Mary was playing in Christianity. The 1300s, that is the 14th century, were another story altogether. Europe was hit by a terrible new wave of bubonic plague, which killed a third of Europe's population, maybe 20 million people altogether. The 100 Years' War between France and England devastated much of France. The Church experienced a Babylonian captivity with rival popes in Avignon and Rome. The Ottoman Turks conquered much of Eastern Europe. Finally, this is the century that experienced terrible climate change. In this case, global cooling, or what is sometimes known as the Little Ice Age. The result was widespread famine as farms became dramatically less productive. The Church and individual Christians responded to this suffering in various ways. The 14th century witnessed a rise of mysticism and a great emphasis on personal devotion. If High Gothic Christendom identified with Christ the innocent baby, Christ the ruler, and Christ the Son of Mary, Late Gothic Christ was identified with Christ the suffering servant who had experienced our troubles and could help lead his people through them. These were the years when Francis of Assisi transformed monasticism by sending monks back to the cities to minister to the poor. The suffering of Christ and his empathy for suffering humans was central to the Franciscans' very popular preaching. Focus on Christ's humanity and suffering resonated especially strongly in Germany, where intellectual High Gothic humanism had never really taken quite as strong a hold. We will see more of these tormented Christs in the art of the Northern Renaissance after Christmas. The term expressionism will return in the 20th century, again used especially to describe German work. Stay tuned. So, what stylistic devices did the artist use to convey this emotion? The paint has faded now, but the torrent of blood would have been a vibrant, dramatic red. The lines of sculpture are twisted and contorted. The scale is not realistic. Mary is much larger than Christ, and perhaps this signals the way Christ is temporarily diminished in death. I'm going to break here and continue in the second podcast so I don't choke YouTube.